this morning we are going to study the entire book of Job very briefly, looking at the outline of Job, the content of Job, and then how it points forward to Christ. And so we're going to go really quickly to cover everything, and then we can have some discussion at the end. The brief background of Job is it's in the wisdom literature of the Old Testament, the Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes. Its inclusion in the Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament has never been questioned by, whether it's Augustine or Irenaeus or Tertullian. It's always been accepted. It has different translations throughout the history of the church have had it in a different order in the canon. So the order that we have follows Jerome, going back to the 5th century, who placed Job in the first position of the wisdom literature. So Job is the first wisdom book, and then Psalms, Proverbs, etc. We don't have any sources for the book of Job. There is a Hebrew tradition that Moses wrote it, but that's just a tradition. There's no authorship ascribed to it. It could have been as early as the time of Abraham, or it could be as frequent or recent as the Persian period, which would be the 5th century BC. We don't really know. My personal opinion is it seems like the language of it and the context of it seems to point more closer to Abraham in that period. But that's just my speculation from reading and studying, so take that for what that's worth. Also, there's no mention of the monarchy, prophets, temple, or any of the patriarchs, so that again leads me to think, okay, this is really old. Job is really old. There's no mention of that. So we don't know when it was written, who wrote it, but there's some thoughts about the context and the language of Job. And there are about 100 words found in Job that are not found anywhere else in the Old Testament. And so there are more. That's called a hapax legomenon. That's the Greek. There are more of those in Job, words that we don't find anywhere else than in any other book in the Old Testament. So there's some interesting language there that is unique to Job that makes it stand out. And again, for me, that just points to, man, this seems like an older book. Probably not in the 5th century BC, maybe in the 18th or 17th century BC. But anyway, the outline of Job that we're going to use, and there's several different outlines you could use, but the simple outline is just, again, to remember that the center of Job, as we just talked about a few minutes ago, is Job chapter 28. That's the wisdom poem of Job. That's the center. So if you work back, the introduction to Job is Job 1 and 2. That sets the scene. And then there's 3 rounds with Job and his friends. So round 1 is chapters 3 through 14. That's the first engagement between Job and his 3, we'll call them, air quotes, friends. Round 2 between Job and his friends is chapters 15 through 21. And that's where it heats up a little bit. We'll talk about that briefly this morning. And then round 3 between Job and his friends is Job 22 through Job 27. And that's where they basically say, and we'll talk about it in a moment, Job, you're guilty. And Job says, okay, show me the crime. The wisdom poem of chapter 28 is the center of Job. That's where Job talks about his understanding of the world and how this does not make sense, what is happening in his life. Then, as we go to the second half of Job, Job 29 through 37 is Job and this younger guy named Elihu, who has remained silent because he's being respectful to the 3 other friends who are probably older, so he's being respectful. That's Job 29 through 37. And then at the end of that round of dialogues between Job and Elihu, now we have God and Job, and there's 2 rounds of that. Job 38 through 40, verse 5 is God and Job, round 1. And then Job 40, verse 6, through the end of Job is God and Job, round 2. So that's kind of the setting of it, or the outline of it. And there's a mixture of all kinds of literature here. There's proverbs, there's riddles, there's hymns, there's laments, there's curses, nature poems, there's narrative, there's dialogue, there's oracles, there's all these different things in Job, which makes it very unique. And as you've read Job, and we're reading through Job in the daily reading, scripture reading, some of y'all are doing that, you see that and experience that Job is not like Genesis. It's not like the Psalms. It has a little bit of Genesis, a little bit of the Psalms, a little bit of wisdom, a little bit of history, a little bit of everything. And it covers themes like obedience, social oppression, religious experience, pious duty. It covers man's relation to God. It covers the role of, and this is a description here, the Satan. That's how he's called in Job, the Satan. It's not Satan, like you'd say someone's name. It is a title, the Satan. That's how it's called in Job. So it covers the theme of the Satan who is accusing God's people. It covers the theme of the nature of God, moral retribution, and the ultimate theme is, why does an innocent man suffer? And that points us forward to Christ. Why does an innocent man suffer? Well, because there's a lot of guilty people like us who face suffering, and God's going to take that away from us. So, again, the introduction, Job has a lot of stuff. We're going quickly this morning. He's got a lot of sheep, camels, oxen, donkeys, servants. This is a wealthy man. Many years ago, I preached down at a church downtown. I was filling in for a pastor. And I remember saying, if Job lived in Charleston, he would be the wealthiest man in Charleston. So that's the context for Job. This is not like your next door neighbor or a guy who lives under a bridge. This is the wealthiest guy in town. So he is a prominent person. That's how we look at Job. And Job, what's interesting here, in the beginning, he offers sacrifices for his children in case they've cursed God and sinned. And that's where, in the introduction, the Satan comes in, and he's been roving the earth, looking and watching. And there's a lot there that we've covered. And again, a lot of our talks on Job from last year, whenever we did that, was it last year maybe, are on our YouTube channel. So you can listen to those for more specifics. But there's some stuff there on the Satan and some of the background content there. But Satan suggests that we test Job to see if his faith is sincere, echoes of Genesis 3. Let's test Adam and Eve and see if their faith is sincere. So this is kind of a similar scene to Genesis chapter 3. And God says, okay, test him, but don't take his life. And that's where you see in Job 1 and 2, in the introduction to Job, he begins to lose family. He begins to lose property. And ultimately, he loses everything but his health. So his animals are killed, flocks, camels, his children, in verses 18 and 19. And it talks about the Sabaeans come in, the Chaldeans. These are actual people groups that come in. And he responds by tearing his robe, shaving his head. Those are ancient Near Eastern practices to demonstrate grief. He's not losing his mind. He is demonstrating how you express grief by taking his clothes off, shaving his head, and demonstrating grief over what he's lost. And he says, in an amazing statement, after all this adversity hits him, he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. A remarkable statement. I would not give that statement. I would be upset. One commentator, Anderson, says that this is the noblest expression to be found anywhere of a man's joyful acceptance of the will of God as his only good. That's a tough one. His joyful acceptance of the will of God as his only good in life. End of chapter 1. In all of this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. That's remarkable. Job remains innocent. God has taken everything but his health and his wife. And it says in all of that, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. And Job does not have the writings of Paul, the writings of Luke, Matthew, Mark to say, oh, well, I have a well-adjusted theology. I read the Westminster Confession of Faith. I know that all things work together. He doesn't have any of that. And yet he does not sin. It's very unbelievable that he does that. So Job has confidence in God, and there's a lot there that we could talk about, but those are on our previous Job talks, Job talk number 1 on our YouTube channel. Then Satan returns and says, well, God, yeah, but you haven't touched his body, his health. But if you touch that, then he's going to curse you. And God says, okay, go for it. You have permission, and that's the language. God gives permission. And again, we talked about it last year when we looked through Job. Satan uses very coarse, direct, informal, almost obscene language in God's presence. He's not there as a formal presence who's using respectful language. He is disrespectful. That's the language that is used. He's challenging God. He's disrespectful to God. And so Job's health is taken from him. And again, Job's reaction, he doesn't sin, but remember Job's wife enters the scene for the first time and she says, curse God and die. Not good advice, but we can understand where she's coming from, right? Not good advice. And historically, she's not been painted well in commentaries. Augustine called her basically the devil. John Chrysostom, who's a 5th century Eastern Orthodox preacher, called her the devil's best scourge. John Calvin called her an organ of Satan. So she's taken a beating for those comments that were recorded, from Augustine to Calvin and others. So Job chapter 3, he laments the tragedy of what's happened, and then we'll go quickly through these to make sure we have time for discussion. Round 1 of Job and his 3 friends. Remember, they show up together, which seems like it was orchestrated, and they sit with Job for a week, which is remarkable. They sit with him for a week, and they keep their mouth shut. That's hard for all of us to do, to sit quietly when someone has lost everything and just sit and be with him. But they do that, and then in chapter 4, Eliphaz begins round one with kind of a tactful response to Job, kind of easing into the confrontation with Job. And then Job replies. And again, Job's replies are often given twice as much space as those of the comments of his friends. So when Eliphaz speaks, Job is given twice as much time to respond. That's a direct construction of the writer, the author of Job, to give more time to Job. Then the second person, Bildad, comes in chapter 8. He's not as courteous, so you see that the volume being turned up. He essentially calls Job a windbag. He says, wild and whirling winds, you're a windbag, Job. You're full of empty words. And Job replies with the same question in Job 9 through 10, his response. He says, how can I be right before God? We're all sinners. Who can contend with God? And then the third friend comes in Job chapter 11, Zophar. He gets his chance to speak, and he brings tough love. So again, the volume gets turned up on Job. He brings tough love to Job. There's very little compassion in Job 11 from Zophar. He disapproves of Job in his words and his actions and doesn't appear to understand where Job's coming from. He says Job's words are babble, they're mockery. He says you're verbose, you're self-righteous, you're opinionated, you're intractable. So, nice guy. Zophar, nice guy. Then Job 12 through 14, the three friends have made their initial statements, and Job they see is hypocritical, he's prideful. But Job, again, refuses to say, I committed these sins that they confront him with. He says, I didn't do any of these things. So if you can show me a sin, I'll confess it, but none of these sins fit me. And Job's response in these chapters, Job 12 through 14, is exceeded in length only by his final speech in Job 29 through 31. So this is a long speech here. And there's some sarcasm in Job's words. Job 13:15 is a famous statement. He says, though he, God, slay me, I will hope in him. And Calvin translates that as, though he slay me, will I not hope in him? He puts a question mark on the end of it. Will I not hope in God? Should I not still hope in him? That's how Calvin translates that. Round two of the friends with Job is Job 15 through 21. Eliphaz speaks. Again, the volume gets turned up. He's more direct. He claims that Job has sinned. Job responds in verses 16 through 17. He says God can do as he pleases. And then Job says, Eliphaz, you and others are miserable comforters. So now it's open conflict between Job and his friends. You're miserable comforters. You're not helping me in my time of loss. Bildad speaks in Job chapter 18. It's a straightforward diatribe on the fate of the wicked. Job, you belong with the wicked, and here's what happens. This is after a man has lost everything. So again, horrible counsel given to Job from Mr. Bildad. And Job responds to Bildad in chapter 19. He has despair because of their counsel. He feels abandoned. Seems about right. And then he expresses confidence in his final vindication. And then we get into the final round of speeches. Zophar speaks again in Job 20. He warns Job about his sin. It's more of the same, essentially. And again, he says, the fate of the wicked is death. And so you need to repent, Job. You need to repent. Job responds in chapter 21. And his speech is unique. He doesn't have a soliloquy where he talks to himself or a prayer, which he's done earlier. He basically reviews a lot of what has been said by his friends, and he quotes them in chapter 21. And it's a formal debate between them. And then the final round continues. Eliphaz speaks in Job chapter 22, and we see that Eliphaz still doesn't get the problem. He doesn't empathize with Job. He calls for Job to face his sin in chapter 22, verses 2 through 11. And then in verses 12 through 20, the end of chapter 22, he gives a tribute to God's greatness with a challenge for Job to repent to that great God. Job replies again, and he gives in chapter 23 and 24 a conventional list of crimes committed, which is not taking care of orphans or widows, harming the poor, seizing land, all those kind of things. And he says, what am I guilty of here? I haven't done any of these things. So chapter 25, Bildad speaks. And this is Bildad's final confrontation with Job, and it's a very short speech, which indicates that their conversation is over. They've had their fight, and now it's over. There's nothing left to say. They think Job is guilty. Job says, show me the crime, and I'll confess. So it's a very short speech. Job replies to him in chapters 26 and 27 with a statement about the greatness of God. Job 28 is the center of Job. It's the wisdom poem. where he talks in verses 1 through 11 that human research has not discovered wisdom. Verses 13 through 19, human wealth can't purchase wisdom. So we haven't found it. Job says, follow the science. He hasn't found it. Job says, I got a lot of money. I can't purchase wisdom. Can't put it on a credit card. And then in verses 21 through 27, he says, God alone has wisdom. And it's a gift. When God gives you wisdom, it's because he decides to. It's a gift. And then the end of chapter 28 is a definition of wisdom. So watching all this has been this young man, Elihu. He's been watching and taking notes, and he thinks he knows the answer to the problem. And he's been respectful and watching and listening to the three older friends as they've talked. So in chapters 29 through 31, Job gives a summary defense, and he lists these different crimes and sins, and he says he's innocent. So we'll go through these very quickly. He says, I'm innocent in chapter 31 of lust. I'm innocent of dishonesty. I'm innocent of adultery. I'm innocent of oppressing the poor because he's a wealthy guy. I'm innocent of being stingy. I've helped. He said, who has come to me that I haven't helped? So I'm not cheap. He says in chapter 31, I've not committed adultery. I've not been greedy, avarice. I've not been vindictive. I've not exploited people. I've not used my land, he was a large landholder, to exploit people. I've not been a hypocrite. In other words, he's not like Adam. We're going back to Genesis 3 because there was that test of Job, which is reminiscent of the test of Adam, where Adam hid his sin. Job says, I will confess if I know what to confess. And so that's why he's listing all these crimes, and he's saying, I haven't done any of these things. Elihu comes in chapter 32 and 33. And as one commentator says, Elihu has the perspective of a young person that sees a little, but sees it very clearly. He doesn't know a lot, but what he knows very well. And he's going to tell Job that. And he's withheld his words out of respect for his elders. Chapter 32, Elihu claims, I am full of words. And as we look here, we'll see that that's true. He's full of words, but they're just empty words. They're hollow platitudes. There's not a lot of content here with Elihu. At the end of chapter 32, we see that Elihu has not given any reason why we should listen to him. He has only said he's anxious to speak and settle the dispute. Elihu gives a second speech in Job chapter 34, and he focuses on maintaining the justice of God, which Job has not argued. Job believes in the justice of God, right? We've seen that. And he appeals to wise men to defend his views. Job chapter 35 is the final speech of Elihu. And he brings up two questions. Why should an individual live right before God? And why doesn't God answer our prayers? And then Job 36 and 37 actually is Elihu's fourth and final speech, where he talks about the themes of the judgment of the wicked, the greatness of God, things that have already been covered by the other three guys, the other three friends. Elihu, here's the main point with Elihu, since we gave him 2 minutes. Elihu does not have a view of God that allows for forgiveness of sins, for mercy. He has a view of God that if you do this, God will do this. Very much mechanical, very much a wooden cause and effect. If you do this, God will do this. There's no sense of, yeah, you're going to sin, but God can forgive. He doesn't have that view. It's very much what we would call today as Protestants a legalistic view. Do this and God will take care of you. Don't do this and God will smite you, right? So then we get to chapter 38 through 40. This is God and Job, round one. And the first speech here that God gives to Job is interesting. Contrary to Job's friends, God does not bring a list of sins to Job. He doesn't do that. He mentions here 20 creatures and elements in the created order. So in chapter 38, you have the earth, the sea, morning, underworld, light, snow, storm, rain, constellations, clouds, lions, ravens, an ibex, wild donkey, ox, ostrich, horse, hawk, and falcon. Those are all listed. It's a lot. It's like going to the zoo. And God points to all these things to say, this is my work, not yours. And so the speech begins when God answers Job out of the whirlwind. That's the language there. And again, the literary point there is Job's suffering began when the whirlwind came in chapter 1. The whirlwind came and destroyed the property, his children. Here God comes again in the language of a whirlwind to answer him. So there's kind of the literary bookends here. Or was active in the first storm, and now he speaks in this storm in chapter 38. Job is invited in chapter 40 to speak, and Job responds with a subdued, humble response. Very, very short, subdued. And so the question is, why is there a second speech from God? Is there two? Because you think, doesn't Job have the answer? Isn't one sermon enough from God? Quoting one commentator here, he says, here's the reason perhaps why there's two speeches. Job's reply here in chapter 40 is somewhat evasive and not satisfactory. The gesture of Job placing his hand over his mouth could be a mark of respect or a sign of silence. Job admits he cannot answer, but he still does not admit to any sin. There's no confession, doesn't retract any former statements. There's no submission to God. On the contrary, he seems to be somewhat sticking to his guns. He's already spoken once and needs say no more. Job has nothing to say that has not already been said. So the idea there is that maybe Job is not fully convinced. Maybe he's just tired. Maybe he's just worn out and doesn't want to speak again. And so God's going to give a final closing argument here where there's the final statement of God. So Job responds in chapter 42, 1 through 6. He says, none of your plans can be frustrated, as he responds to God's second speech to Job, which is a long nature speech from God. A very long nature speech, which is much longer than the poems in the first speech of God. The second nature poem that God gives to Job takes up 1/4 of the total space of God speaking to Job. So that's the main part, is that final nature speech where God again points to his creation and says, where were you, Job, when I was doing all this? Were you my intern? Were you my assistant? Were you helping with all this stuff? No, you weren't even present. I don't need your help. So chapter 42, we'll finish up here. The verdict, after addressing Job, the Lord turns to his 4 friends. We'll use that term friends loosely. Eliphaz is addressed by names, perhaps indicating that Eliphaz is the oldest, so there's the respect given to him. Although God is angry with them for their words towards Job, God does not deal with them according to their sin. And compare God's anger with the anger Elihu had at Job's friends. God is angry at Job's friends here. In all their speeches, none of their friends considered the possibility that they, not Job, might be the objects of God's wrath, because God is clearly angry not at Job, but at these 4 guys who think they know everything. And here we see an interesting picture at the end. Job makes a sacrifice for his friends, and the sacrifice, which is a priestly role. He's sacrificing for them. And the sacrifice is not just, hey, $20 and we're done. The sacrifice, I'm going to quote here, the sacrifice is costly. 7 bulls and 7 rams. Only royalty could afford such an offering. The sacrifice is referred to as a burnt offering, which is a common offering in the Old Testament. As part of the ritual, hands were laid on the animal's head, firstly to identify them. And the victim of with the worshiper, so a scapegoat. This person is guilty, and that the sin of that person is placed on the animal. And so this is a large sacrifice that Job does on behalf of someone else. Again, pictures, we're going to talk about this in 2 minutes, pictures of Christ who does offer a sacrifice for others, for us. And the number is 7 here, a number of totality. And it's only after Job offers his sacrifice, it says, then God will accept his prayer and not deal with you according to your folly. After the sacrifice that Job gives for his friends, then God answers their prayer. So, priestly role of Job. Then Job's given double of everything he had at the beginning of the story. So you see 14,000 sheep, 6,000 camels, everything's doubled. His family, he has a large family again, and it says he lived 140 years, saw 4 generations of his descendants. So he was retired. And it says he died an old man, full of love, full of days, is the text, which is again a reference back to, an allusion back to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who it says, when they died an old man full of days, and they rested with their fathers. So it's a reminiscent of the patriarchs. And Joseph, if you remember Joseph, son of Israel, son of Jacob, only saw 3 descendants, 3 generations of his descendants. Here Job sees 4. So there's a greatness of Job that is demonstrated here. And then the final comment before we go into just a couple of redemptive historical points is in the conclusion, something is missing that was in the introduction, and that is the Satan, which means the accuser, the adversary. He's not even mentioned. And the reason for that, the literary reason for that is essentially he's irrelevant. God is relevant. He is the only actor that is relevant in his relation with his creature, with his follower, Job. Satan is pointless. He was being used to demonstrate something. So Satan is not, the Satan, as he's called, is not given any space in the final verses of Job. He's insignificant compared to the power of God. So very quickly, how does this point forward to Christ? And I'm just going to go through a couple things very quickly, and then we'll have some time to talk here. I'm just going to list these. The book of Job introduces in the Old Testament the idea that suffering is not always the result of sin or the result of disobedience. Sometimes the innocent suffer. You don't see that a lot in the Old Testament. This introduces the idea. Secondly, Job's piety, according to the Satan, is artificial. It needs to be tested. You see that paralleled in the New Testament where Christ is tested in the wilderness. And the Satan comes to him and says, well, if you just turn these stones into bread, if you just throw yourself down, your angels, there's a testing there to see who this person is. And so Job is tested. That points us forward to Christ who is tested. Job is ultimately the picture of an innocent man who suffers. And as we look forward to the New Testament, we realize there's really only one truly innocent person who suffers, and that's Christ, who suffers for our sins and who has done nothing wrong. Job's suffering, in Job chapter 2, verse 12, it says, Job's suffering made him unrecognizable to his friends. It would be as if he came in the back of the Darby building and it was someone we knew, and we said, "Who is that? A visitor? That person looks terrible." And we're all kind of doing this, right? I won't use a name. That's Job. I won't use a name. Similar to Christ, Isaiah 53 verses 2 through 4 about the suffering of Christ prophetically. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised and we esteemed him not. He was smitten by God and afflicted. So there you see a similar pattern. Next point, Job believes in a resurrection. Job 19, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth, or upon the dust. After my skin has been destroyed, Job says, yet in the flesh I shall see God. Job believes there is something after death. There is some type of resurrection. Christ, as we know in John chapter 11, says, I am the resurrection and the life. If you believe in me, you'll never taste death, he says. So in Job chapter 16, verses 19 through 21, Job looks to a divine mediator for help. A referee is kind of the imagery there. He says, even now, behold, my witnesses in heaven who testifies for me on high. Oh, that he would argue the case of a man with God as the Son of Man does with his neighbor. Job wants a mediator. Christ is our mediator. 1 John chapter 2, verse 1. If anyone does sin, he has an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous. Next point, Job believes not only in the resurrection, but in a Redeemer. Job 19, verse 25, I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last, or at the end of days, he will stand upon the earth. That is that Hebrew word goel, the Redeemer. You think about the story of Ruth and Boaz. He is the one who redeems her in that story. Christ is the ultimate Redeemer. We know that. Job is looking for wisdom. We know in John chapter 1, we know in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 23 and 24, that Christ is the wisdom of God, the Logos of God. Paul says in Corinthians 1, 23 and 24, we preach Christ crucified, which is a stumbling block to Jews, folly to Gentiles, but to those who are called, Christ is the power and the wisdom of God. John chapter 1 is a full text on that. Let's see, there's a lot of notes on that. Let's go to the next point here as we wrap up. Divine mediator. Next point, in Job chapter 33, verse 24, Job refers to a divine mediator who can pay a ransom for the afflicted. He says, and he is merciful to him and says, deliver him from going down into the pit. I have found a ransom. We know that's the ministry of Christ, who is a mediator who pays the ransom. Matthew 20, verse 28, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others, and to give his life as a ransom, a payment to God, not to Satan, to God, to rescue us. The divine mediator next will redeem the afflicted one from death. We see that in Job 33:30, to bring his soul from the pit. That's a poetic reference to death, that he may be lighted with the light of life. Christ does that. Here we see that the afflicted are not delivered by their sufferings. Job was not delivered by suffering, but ultimately it's going to point forward to the suffering of Christ on the cross. Christ is the one that his suffering is effectual, efficacious for us. A couple quick points as we finish here. The word that, there's a huge application here, but we're going to stop with this. The word that Job expected from God is not what he wanted from God is not what he received from God. Job wanted an answer to why this happened. Did Job get that? No, he did not. When Christ comes, it is, as we see in Luke chapter 20, and we talked about this a little bit last week, there are 6 different conflict narratives in Luke 20 and 21. Here we see Christ is not what the people expected. That's why they oppose him. The leaders oppose him. What Job got from God in chapters 40 and 42, the words from God, was not what he expected. And that's often the case for us. We think, God, I just need you to answer A, B, and C. And God says, I don't really owe you those answers. I will give you what I think is best for you. That's hard to accept. Galatians 4, verse 4, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. When the fullness of time came, God sent his Son. It wasn't what we expected. It wasn't what the leaders in Jerusalem expected. And that's why he says in Corinthians 1, it's folly to those who are perishing. We can't believe in this retired carpenter who died. Finally, Job is a priest, not just for his family, but also for the people beyond his family. He offers that sacrifice. We talked about that. Job is referred to twice as my servant, which is not common in the Old Testament. Abraham is a servant of God. Jacob is a servant of God. Moses and King David are servants of God. Ultimately, who is the final suffering servant? Christ is the final suffering servant of God, the true servant of Job. So Job is a righteous man. These are all parallels to Christ. He's a righteous man handed over to God by God for suffering. He's mistreated by others. He prays for those who oppose him and persecute him, just like Christ does. This righteous man, Job, like Christ, offers a sacrifice to mediate between God and sinners. Job does that in chapter 42. This righteous man is publicly vindicated by God, just as Christ is. Corinthians chapter 15, the ascension, Matthew 28. This righteous man, Job, and Christ are exalted and given greater honor and wealth than they had before, just as Christ is. 1 Corinthians 15 is a reference there for that. Christ is the mediator. The primary purpose of the book of Job, last point, is to prepare readers for Christ. One commentator, Robinson, says the book of Job is the first draft of the gospel story. That's how he describes it. The fundamental theme of the book of Job is not to answer the why question of suffering, which is the question we always have, right? Rather, the questions are who and where. Job, who are you to speak to God? And God says, where were you when I created all things? Who are you to question me? That's really the answers he gets. So let me stop there.